Hello, First Church, and any friends that are joining us online. Great to be with you. Pastor Todd here. We've been talking about overcoming fear and anxiety. And today I'm going to share a very familiar story from the scriptures with you to reflect further on this topic. I want to begin with a different story, though. A few years ago, this story became very popular in various news channels. It's a story of a Georgia grandma named Dee Phillips. One day, as this grandma was stepping outside into her front yard, a wild bobcat came lunging at her to attack her. And Dee Phillips, rather than running away or screaming for help, stood her ground and actually, as she tells the story, grabbed the bobcat with her bare hands around its throat as it lunged at her. And as the bobcat was clawing at her, attempting to attack her, she held her ground and held her grip even tighter until finally she ended the life of this bobcat that had come after her. But there are more details to the story that make it even more incredible. She shares that her granddaughter was asleep in the house behind her, and so as this wild bobcat lunged at her and she grabbed it by the throat with her bare hands, she continued to hold it there out in front of herself in silence because she didn't want to wake up her granddaughter who was asleep in the house behind her. Can you imagine that? I mean, who has a story like that to tell of their grandmother and her bravery and her resolve to do such an incredible thing? I've never met a bobcat in the wild. I've seen them in zoos, and they are no small creature. And they are fierce, as fierce can be. So, I mean, amazing that this grandmother had such strength and determination to do what she did. I imagine what enabled her to carry out this amazing feat was this clear sense within her that it was her role, it was her responsibility in that moment to protect her granddaughter. And part of her reason for doing this in silence, I would imagine, was she didn't want to wake her granddaughter and have the risk of her granddaughter coming outside and potentially being attacked by this animal or others that might be nearby. And that's what I want to talk about today, is this sense of clarity. Clarity about who we are and who we are, particularly in the face of our fears. And the story of David and Goliath, as we know, David faced a great fear. He faced a great threat. But as he did so with clarity. Clarity of who he is and clarity about who God is. And so the scene is set for us in 1 Samuel 17. The armies of Israel and the armies of the Philistines have come out to do battle. And each army is encamped on an opposing side of a valley. And the army of the Philistines splits, and this giant, massive, armor-clad man walks forth, Goliath. And he steps forward before the armies of Israel and taunts them, saying, "Send from among your ranks a champion to face me. And if he can defeat me, we will submit to you." Now in 1 Samuel, we learn all these details about Goliath, which I think is very interesting. 1 Samuel tells us things like the weight of his armor, that the armor that Goliath wore weighed more than 91 pounds, which is a lot of weight for one to be carrying around, especially in the midst of combat. We're told that he had a spear, and the head of the spear weighed more than 11 pounds, which doesn't sound like much on paper, but imagine throwing a long spear with a head weighing 11 pounds across a battlefield, and how much strength it would take to carry out such a feat. We're told that Goliath was more than 9 feet tall. Now, those of you who know me, I'm a tall guy. I'm 6'4" just about. That's almost 3 feet on me. That's a big guy. And Goliath had a shield bearer who carried a large shield before him, and a helmet of bronze and other pieces of armor that were upon himself. He was a living, breathing tank coming before the Israelites and challenging them to a one-on-one duel. And we're told in 1 Samuel 17 that he persisted in this act for 40 days. He came out and paraded himself before the Israelites. And for those 40 days, not a single man from the Israelite army came forth to challenge Goliath. But then one day, David, as he's been sent down from his father to bring food to his brothers who were there as a part of the army of Israel, hears the taunts of Goliath. And a courage and strength wells up within David, and he has this sense of clarity that it is his role to stand up not just for the armies of Israel, but more importantly, to stand up for the name of God, for God's reputation, which he sees being sullied, being tarnished by this foul-mouthed giant man from the Philistine army. And so David takes it upon himself to be the one, even as a young man, to step forward and face Goliath in one-on-one combat. How does he do that? That's an incredible act of courage for a young man to undertake. Well, we learn some things about David in this story. David had clarity. He knew himself. He knew who he was, and he knew his strengths, and he had a strong sense of self that was rooted in his relationship with God. Not only did David know himself, but David knows God. He knows clearly who God is. He knows what God is capable of, and he knows what it means to walk in the confidence that we have when we have a life that's rooted firmly in our relationship with God. David understands the dynamics of his relationship with God as well. If you recall and had the chance to watch last week's video, Pastor Derek shared on this great passage from the beginning chapter of the book of Joshua. After Moses has passed on, the role of leadership of the people of Israel has now fallen into the hands of Joshua. And he's preparing himself to lead the people of Israel into the promised land. And so in Joshua 1, verses 1 through 9, there are several moments when God speaks these words to Joshua to be strong and courageous. And in these words, God speaks about how he is with Joshua and how he is with his people, and how his presence with his people will empower them to go forth into their future. Later on in the book of Joshua, in the very closing chapter, there's this poignant moment between God and his people, where Joshua is speaking to the people and puts this question before them, saying, choose this day whom you will serve. Whether you will serve the gods your fathers served back in Egypt, or the gods of the Amorites in whose land they now are living. But he says, but now for me and my house, we will serve the Lord. So David, being an Israelite, had these stories in his mind and understood the promises that God had made in these chapters of the life of the people of Israel. And he understood how God was faithful to those who put their trust and their hope in him. And so it was that clarity that enables David to go forth and to face this great fear named Goliath. I want to read for you just a small portion of the story of David and Goliath. It's really the climax of the story. It's the moment when David charges forth to fight the giant. And so I'll be reading from 1 Samuel 17, beginning in verse 44. The Philistine Goliath said to David, "Come to me, and I will give your flesh to the birds of the air and to the beasts of the field." Then David said to the Philistine, "You come to me with a sword and with a spear and with a javelin, but I come to you in the name of the Lord of hosts, the God of the armies of Israel, whom you have defied. This day the Lord will deliver you into my hand, and I will strike you down and cut off your head. And I will give the dead bodies of the hosts of the Philistines this day to the birds of the air and to the wild beasts of the earth, that all the earth may know that there is a God in Israel. And that all this assembly may know that the Lord saves not with sword and spear, for the battle is the Lord's, and he will give you into our hand." Now we know what happens next. David charges the field, not with a sword, not with a shield, not with armor. He resisted those things that Saul tried to impose upon him. No, David goes out with a sling and a handful of smooth stones. And he takes that sling and fires a perfect shot that embeds itself into Goliath's forehead and drops him down dead. After which David strolls over and picks up Goliath's sword and does what he said he would do, cuts off the head of the giant. David knew who he was. He had clarity about himself. David knew who God was. He had clarity about God's identity and God's power. David had clarity about the purposes of God that he was to follow and to carry out. Jesus' life parallels these qualities of David. Jesus also had clarity. He had clarity about who he was. If you remember at his baptism, as he comes out of the waters, the Father speaks from heaven and affirms the identity of Jesus, saying, "This is my Son whom I love. Listen to him." And in his temptation in the wilderness, Jesus confronts Satan himself and stands firm 3 separate times when he's tempted by Satan. And he stands firm in the words and promises of God and moves forward with victory. And when faced with his imminent death, again, Jesus yields himself to the will of the Father. There's clarity in Jesus. Jesus understands that the will of the Father is good and that the will of the Father will lead to success. That involves his death. But Jesus knows that it's through his death that victory will be secured. And so he surrenders to the path that the Father has put before him. But the key ingredient that's present both in the story of Jesus as well as the story of David is this clarity that they both have about who they are, about whose they are, and about what it means to trust in the Father's plan. And so what about you and me? We face fears. The reason for having this topic for several weeks is because there's so much in our lives to feel afraid of, to feel anxious about. And so what do we do when those come our way? Well, today's text invites us to know who we are in God, and to operate out of that understanding of our identity, to have the same clarity that David had, that Jesus had, a clarity about our identity, a clarity about his identity, his power, and his strength, and clarity about his purposes. Our fears don't just go away if we ignore them. They pop up in some other way. Or they persist like Goliath did for 40 days as he walked back and forth before the armies of Israel. He wasn't going away. And the longer they sat there and looked at what it was that they were terrified of, the deeper that fear welled up within them, until David came on the scene and brought with him this sense of clarity and saw through the veneer of Goliath and saw through that to see the victory of God. And Jesus did the same. We're told that Jesus felt fear in the Garden of Gethsemane as he knew that his death was imminent. But we're also told in that story that Jesus saw through the veneer of that fear and saw the victory of God that awaited him on the other side of the cross. The scriptures teach us that God is victorious. Oftentimes in our lives, it doesn't feel like God is victorious. Oftentimes it feels like we are buried under the weight of our fears and our anxieties and the problems that persist in our world and in our lives. But the scriptures teach us that God's victory is the final victory. Jesus on the cross spoke these words, "It is finished," making a declaration in the context of human history that his victory on the cross was real. And in the book of Revelation, again, Jesus speaks these words of promise that, "Behold, I am making everything new." And so while we live in between his victory on the cross and the moment when he returns and brings history to its fulfillment and makes everything new and restores all of that which is broken, we can live out of that future that God has revealed to us. We can live with hope. We can live with clarity that we are God's people, We can live with clarity that God is all-powerful, that God is victorious. And we can live with clarity that as we trust in his promises and follow his ways in the face of our fears and anxieties, that he will be faithful and he will deliver us. And so may you go forth this day and may you face your fears. May you face that which is causing anxiety in your lives with confidence that comes from knowing who you are in Jesus. May you trust that his ways are good. And may you live them out, even in the face of that which scares you most. May you go with the hope that we have in Christ. Amen.